It all started on the first night after I moved in. I hadn't meant to pick a house as isolated as this one, but I was desperate for a change, a fresh start. After my divorce and a messy departure from my old job, I needed to get away from the city. I found the house through an obscure real estate site. It was an old Victorian-style mansion, the kind of place that screamed fixer-upper. But it was cheap, and that's what mattered. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. The nearest house was across the street, an equally ancient building. It looked unoccupied, windows covered in grime, the lawn overgrown with weeds. I remember thinking that no one could possibly live there. But that was before I saw the face. The first night in the house was uneventful, until I went to bed. I had barely settled in, the boxes still unopened, the faint scent of mold clinging to the walls. As I lay in bed, half asleep, I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The kind of prickling sensation that crawls up your spine and makes your skin tighten. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, trying to shake off the feeling. But then I looked toward the window. Across the street, in the house opposite mine, there was a figure standing in the window, staring at me. It was too dark to see any details, just the silhouette of a person backlit by a faint light. They didn't move. They didn't wave or shift. Just stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor, curious about the new guy in town. After all, people here seemed to keep to themselves, and maybe I was just imagining that they might be watching me. I convinced myself they were probably just wondering who would buy that decrepit old house after it had been left empty for so many years. But when I woke up the next morning, I glanced out the window, almost hoping to see a familiar face or at least some hint of life. Instead, my stomach dropped. The window across the street was empty, the figure gone. The house itself looked lifeless in the morning light, cold, empty, the paint peeling off in brittle gray flakes. The windows were thick with grime, blocking most of the light, and the whole place seemed to sag as though it had given up on ever being cared for again. It didn't look like a place anyone would choose to live in, much less linger in the window night after night. That night the figure was back. I blinked, my pulse quickening, feeling an inexplicable chill crawl down my spine as I stared out my own window. They stood in the same place, watching, facing my direction as if I were the only thing on their mind. I could almost feel their gaze penetrating, heavy. When I looked closer, expecting them to wave, shift, or even look away as I stared, they didn't move. Not a flicker of motion. I watched until my eyes burned, until I finally crawled into bed, hoping that ignoring them would make the feeling go away. But it didn't. The figure returned the next night, and the night after that. Always there, always watching, always motionless. The longer it went on, the more it dug under my skin, a slow, gnawing anxiety that grew with each passing day. I tried closing the curtains, focusing on unpacking, staying busy, but the sensation of that unseen gaze only grew stronger. A quiet dread crept over me, a feeling I hadn't known before, one I couldn't shake. My mind whirled with questions. Who stands for hours on end, never moving, never turning? And why were they watching me? Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. While out picking up groceries, I stopped a local, a hunched old woman behind the counter with an expression that seemed to hide more than it revealed. I asked her casually about the house across the street from mine, trying to mask the unease in my voice. At first, she just glanced at me, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting quickly toward the door as though she was worried someone might overhear. Then, in a low, almost fearful mutter, she said,
"Nobody lives there. No one's lived in that house for over 40 years. After what happened, nobody's wanted to."
"What do you mean? I've seen someone there every night. They just stand in the window, watching." Her face paled. And she shook her head. She wouldn't say more, but I didn't need her to. I could feel it now, a deep unease, the kind that coils in your gut and festers. Something was wrong with that house. Something ancient. What took place there? I stopped sleeping. Every night I stayed up watching the watcher, waiting for it to do something, anything, but it never did. Just stood there. One night, as I sat by the window keeping my vigil, I decided to test it. I turned off every light in my house, making sure the watcher couldn't see me, and I slowly approached the window, crouching just below the sill. I peeked over the edge, expecting to see the figure in its usual place. But the window was empty. For the first time in weeks, the figure wasn't there. My relief was short-lived. As I sat back, heart pounding, I heard it. A faint creaking sound, like footsteps in my hallway. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I wasn't alone. The house was old, it made noises, sure, but this was different. These footsteps were deliberate, measured. Someone, something, was inside with me. I stood up slowly, every muscle tense, and grabbed the nearest object I could use as a weapon, an old fire poker from the hearth. I moved cautiously through the house, every shadow suddenly deeper, more sinister. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I turned the corner into the hallway and froze. Standing at the far end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of the faint moonlight filtering through the windows, was the figure from the house across the street. It was inside my home, standing perfectly still, just like in the window. I could see its face now, or rather, its lack of one. There were no features. Just smooth, pale skin stretched too tightly over a skull-like head. It was as if something had taken the shape of a person but hadn't gotten the details right. Before I could scream, it tilted its head like a curious animal, and then it was gone. No flash, no sound, just vanished, leaving me standing there, heart hammering in my chest. Every hair in my body standing. I had never been so frightened before. I ran out of the house that night. I didn't care where I went as long as it was away. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked miles away, trying to make sense of what I had seen. When I returned the next day, the house across the street was demolished. A pile of rubble where it had once stood. I asked around, but no one seemed to know anything about it. No one had seen a demolition crew, and the house had supposedly been empty for decades. But every now and then, late at night, when I glance out my window, I swear I still see it. The figure standing there, watching. Not across the street. Not in the window of the house that's been reduced to rubble. No. It's here now. In my house. In the corner of my room. In the hallway just out of sight, lurking at the edges of the darkness. Sometimes I catch it in the reflection of a mirror, or in the gleam of a window standing behind me, closer than before. I don't know when it started. Maybe the moment the house was torn down, it latched onto me. Or maybe it always had. Maybe it was never tied to that house at all. Some nights I hear the floorboards creak, and I know it's moving through my home, silent and waiting. When I wake up, I see things slightly out of place. Objects shifted, furniture subtly disturbed, as though someone, or something, has been there while I slept. It doesn't just watch me anymore. It's with me every day, every night. I've started avoiding my own home, spending hours in cafes, driving aimlessly through town, trying to delay the inevitable return. But it doesn't matter. No matter how far I go, no matter how long I stay away, I know it's there when I return. And I know deep down that it's waiting for me to come back, for good. It's patient. It doesn't need to rush. It knows I'll never truly leave. I can't escape it. I've thought about leaving, about packing up and abandoning this house forever. But what would be the point? I know it would follow me no matter where I go. It's not bound to this place. It's bound to me now. I can feel it. A constant presence just behind me, watching, waiting. So I stay, trapped in my own home living in fear, because running won't save me. No matter how far I go, no matter how fast I run, I know it will always be there, watching. Because it comes with me.